Hi again. This is part 2 of our discussion of soils and mineral nutrition of plants. Mineral nutrition, of course, being the study of how plants obtain, distribute, and use mineral nutrients. So to move forward with this conversation, we have to have a good understanding first of what a mineral is and what a nutrient also is. The distinction being that a mineral would be any inorganic element, usually acquired as an inorganic ion from the soil, for example. A nutrient specifically is a substance that could be a mineral that's needed for a plant to survive or necessary for the synthesis of organic compounds. So the distinction between something that happens to be present in the soil, an inorganic element, versus something that's definitely needed by the plant. Now, what would we consider an essential nutrient? Pause the video for a second, jot down your answer, and then restart. Of course, an essential nutrient is a chemical element that's required for the plant to grow from a seed and to complete its entire life cycle. So the important part of essential is that it is going to be needed at some part of the life cycle in order for the plant to complete that full life cycle. Plants require 9 macronutrients and at least 7 micronutrients in order to complete their full life cycle. So 16 elements are essential. How many of these can you list? Stop for a minute and jot down as many as you can think of that are macronutrients or micronutrients. As I said in the last lecture, I'd like to set up iClicker or something so that we can do activities like this as a group, even across the span of a week. So yes, essential plant nutrients. Here's a chart that breaks them down. We have the basic elements that we've talked about so far to a large extent in here: carbon, hydrogen, oxygen, the key ingredients in glucose. These are elements that are taken from the air and the water and that form the framework, the structure of the plant. Then we have a number of macronutrients over here. We've talked quite a bit too about nitrogen and phosphorus. Potassium is in this group, calcium, magnesium, and sulfur. And then we have the micronutrients that are equally essential, but just not needed in as large of quantities. Things like zinc and copper and manganese and iron. This next table gives us a sense of what some of the functions of those macro and micronutrients would be, as well as the framework elements of carbon and oxygen and hydrogen. You're well aware that those are key ingredients in all sorts of major organic compounds. So let's focus on things like nitrogen, which is an essential component of nucleic acids, amino acids, proteins. We've talked about how nitrogen is a key ingredient in Rubisco, which is critical, the enzyme critical for photosynthesis. It's a critical component of chlorophyll. Potassium is involved in osmosis, in ion balance, in opening and closing of stomata. Calcium is critical in cell walls and some plant tissues. Magnesium is an essential component of chlorophyll. Phosphorus, of course, we've talked about quite a lot, is a critical component in ATP and also of the electron carriers, NADP, NADPH, for example. It's also critical for energy transfer and storage. So we have this whole suite of macronutrients and their functions. Here is the list of micronutrients showing you that the concentrations of these elements are remarkably low, but they remain essential. There's critical aspects of each of these within plant functioning. So when the plant doesn't have enough of one of these elements, when concentrations of a nutrient decrease below the typical range, that's when we start to see nutrient deficiencies. There are a lot of common symptoms. I'm sure you've seen these in your houseplants or in your garden plants. Things like chlorosis, where the leaves lack chlorophyll. They can be yellow and brittle and papery with a zinc or an iron deficiency. They might accumulate anthocyanin pigments. Leaves can be dark or purple with nitrogen or phosphorus deficiency. You'll see pictures of these on the next slide. Necrosis, leaf tips or margins might die. Tips might die with potassium deficiency or margins with manganese deficiency. And you see these reflected in how the plants look. So this, when we were starting to see odd coloration in the brassica plants, for example, some of this looked like potentially nutrient deficiencies. So here is a zinc deficiency, a chlorosis, a yellowing of the leaves, a phosphorus deficiency, a dark purple color. I saw some dark shading in some of the brassica leaves. Here's potassium deficiency where the margins have died, and also manganese deficiency where the internal areas are dying. So clearly we can see these kinds of deficiencies within the leaves of the plants because they can be critical to how the plant's functioning. We've looked at a number of graphs like this one when we've been looking at effects on photosynthesis or respiration. In this case, we're using this style of graph to look at the concentration of nutrients in the plant tissue and when the effects of changing concentrations of nutrients would be on the growth or yield of the plants. What is the percent of maximum growth that they can reach as nutrient concentrations increase? And you can see that the shape of this graph is very similar to what we've seen elsewhere, looking at the response, for example, of photosynthesis to increasing light availability. As we increase the concentration of the nutrient, we see an increase in growth of the plants within this deficiency zone, within this region where nutrient concentrations are low. When we reach a reasonable concentration, a critical concentration of the nutrient, the plant does well. It grows at an approximately constant rate. What this tells us is that something else must be limiting growth at this point, rather than the nutrient that we are focusing on. And when we reach a high enough concentration of that nutrient, we're in the toxic zone. So very similar to what we've seen with photosynthesis as light increases, for example. Patterns of deficiency in a nutrient and the kinds of patterns we saw in the earlier slides can reflect how mobile that nutrient might be within the plant. So we have a number of nutrients listed here that are mobile in the plant. Once they come in and end up in one location, they can be moved somewhere else. Nitrogen, potassium, magnesium are all in that category. And then we have a number of other nutrients that are relatively immobile in the plant: calcium, sulfur, iron, boron, copper. These are nutrients that tend to stay put. So think for a minute, stop and think for a minute. If we had young leaves in a plant and we had a mobile element, would those young leaves be likely to show a nutrient deficiency or not? Or if we have an immobile element like calcium or sulfur, would the young leaves show the nutrient deficiency or would the older leaves show the nutrient deficiency? Stop and think for a second and then we'll talk about that idea. Okay, so let's think about mobile elements like nitrogen. If we have a mobile element like nitrogen or phosphorus in our plant and we have younger leaves, presumably the nitrogen will be able to move to those younger leaves. So it would be the older tissues showing the nutrient deficiency. If we have an immobile element like calcium or sulfur, then that immobile element is going to have been taken up by the plant and stay where it's put. So those older leaves are going to look fine, but the younger leaves will not be able to take advantage of the calcium or sulfur that's present, and the young leaves will show the nutrient deficiency. So there can be interesting patterns of deficiency depending on whether an element is able to move through the plant once it arrives there. So to summarize, we talked earlier in section 1 about root structure and root absorption, and we learned that root mineral absorption tends to be selective. It's regulated by the endodermis that blocks apoplastic transport to the xylem, blocks minerals from coming between cell walls and ending up in the rest of the plant. So there's a regulatory aspect that prevents the plant from potentially being harmed. Here in this section, we emphasized macro and micronutrients that the plant requires and some of their functions. And we see that plants exhibit certain kinds of symptoms when levels of the nutrients that they need are low, as well as exhibiting a very typical response curve as nutrient concentrations tend to increase. That's very similar to the response curves we've seen in other areas, for example, with photosynthesis. So in our next section, we're going to talk quite a bit more about nutrient availability. What is controlling the availability of nutrients to plants? Where are plants getting their nutrients? What kinds of factors are important in determining whether plants have enough of the nutrients that they need?